Hey everyone, Matt Brunig here. Thank you for watching my first video. This is video number 2. Especially want to thank Furiosoto, who pointed out that the volume on the first video was too quiet and then I need to mix them louder in the future. I noticed that as well. I am sincerely looking for this kind of feedback because I do want to make this stuff as high quality as possible, so thank you to him. For this video, I wanted to do a kind of version of responding to another video, so instead of going through one of my own articles with a little talking head, I'll just put the little talking head into another video and give you my take on that. I figured what better place to start than PragerU, which I know is very big on this platform. So I searched for PragerU and socialism. This is the first video that came up. It has 11 million views, which is kind of inconceivable, but I'm just going to hop in and see what I think about the quality of this content here.
Capitalism versus socialism. We can sum up each economic system in one line. Capitalism is based on human greed. Socialism is based on human need, right?
No.
No. Wrong. Wrong.
Okay.
It's exactly backwards.
It's backwards. Okay, so I mean, before he gets going, I just want to get my cards on the table, right? I would say that the difference between socialism and capitalism has to do with how ownership and control of enterprises is organized. It's not about need or greed or anything quite so abstract as that, right? So in a capitalist society, the firms, or I would say a capitalist firm, put aside the word society, a capitalist firm is one in which you have private owners, typically shareholders, and that's how that goes, and they elect a board and on, and they do a CEO, and the company is operating to generate profits for these private owners, right? And then in a socialist society, an enterprise is governed differently. Instead of these private shareholders, it might be owned by the workers in the firm. It might be owned by the government, which is an elected government. Arguably could be owned by the consumers in a consumer co-op, right? So it's fundamentally about these different ways of governing the ownership of the company. It's not about need, greed, and that sort of thing. But he's going to make the case, I guess, that socialism is about greed and capitalism is about need. So that'll be interesting.
Give it to you. Been on Amazon lately?
Mm-hmm.
Each of the thousands of products Amazon offers represents the work of people who believe they have something you want or need.
Mm-hmm.
If they're right, they prosper.
How does
If
Amazon
they're
treat
wrong,
its
they
workers?
don't. That's how the free market works.
Right.
It encourages people to improve their lives by satisfying the needs of others.
Mm-hmm.
No one starts a business making a thing or providing a service for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They start a business to make things or provide services for others.
Mm-hmm.
I speak from personal experience. When I was the CEO of the company that owns Carl's Jr. and Hardee's restaurant chains, we spent millions of dollars every year trying to determine what customers wanted. If our customers didn't like something, we changed it, and fast. Because if we didn't, our competitors would, pun intended, eat us for lunch. The consumer.
Okay, so I mean, right off the bat, his refutation of the idea that capitalism is about greed is that in a capitalist firm tries to sell things to consumers for money. Is there any socialist that says that that's not true? I've never heard anyone say that's not true. What the socialists typically don't like is how the production is organized. It's not the part where you make stuff for other people that they have issues with. It's how the production itself is organized, where you have a handful of shareholders who own, the vast majority of the enterprises in the economy, and then through that ownership, they're able to extract income without having to work. And then the workers in those firms are in a very precarious position because they can be fired very easily, and arguably, perhaps they are not being compensated the full value of what they contribute, because a lot of what they contribute is instead being siphoned off to the owner owners. All of that's compatible with the idea of producing goods for a consumer market. The idea is that in the production of goods for a consumer market, like ahead of the part where it gets to the consumer market, there is an ownership arrangement that is perhaps exploitative and at the very minimum certainly not like democratic. So that's it's just kind of missing the mark to my mind on what we need to be arguing about here. So
that's you. Has the
me.
ultimate.
See, I'm the consumer. That's the only thing. I'm not a worker. I may not be. It's just the consumer. There's the consumer and there's the entrepreneur. Those are the only two people that exist in this society. Only two facets of human life that exist, right? Not the worker. Never mind, the socialist seems to talk a lot about the worker. We don't yet have him mentioned here. Okay, so the consumer, that's me. What do I do?
Power. In effect, you vote with every dollar you spend.
Vote with every
in a
dollar,
socialist economy.
Right. So yeah, hey, when you consumer demand helps determine what it is that firms help produce. But think about it: if every dollar is a vote, do we all have equal dollars to vote? And if we don't, is that a problem? Because if you're saying that the corporate sector responds to consumer demand by sort of contorting the productive apparatus to try to chase dollars. And then we also know that rich people have hundreds of times more dollars than middle and lower income people. Then it would seem that the economy is being organized, the production of goods is being organized in a way that serves the consumer demand disproportionately of affluent people. And someone might object to that. They might say, I don't know if we should use all of these scarce resources, all of this material and labor in order to produce yachts for very rich people, or in order to produce, whatever it is that rich people consume, way more than poor people consume. So again, that's part of the thing, right? What if in the production process, the owners of the economy are able to extract, 30% of the income, and then now the economy is set up to try to service the wants of the ownership class, because of course the economy is set up to chase dollars in the consumer market, which the ownership class has more of. Again, not really hitting the issues. You don't even have to necessarily have to agree with that, but at least address it, because that's really where the gravity of the argument is.
The government has the ultimate power. It decides what you get from a limited supply it decides should exist. Instead of millions of people making millions of decisions about what they want, a few people, government elites, decide what people should have and how much they should pay for it.
Okay, so he's mixing up here planning and socialism. Planning can exist in any kind of society. Right now, for example, public schools are a form of planning, right? I don't pay a fee to go to a public school. Public schools, 90% of kids in the U.S. go to public schools. It's pretty common throughout the world. The government, they kind of make an assessment of how many kids are in a given area, and they build schools and hire teachers based on the idea, this is how many kids we need to educate. And they do this without prices, at least without consumer prices. Of course, they're paying prices for the construction of schools, and they're paying prices to teachers and all that kind of stuff. But that's just a form of planning, right? You don't need the dollars, or prices to make that work. But there are other areas of life where you can absolutely use dollars and prices and it still be socialistic, right? Because socialism is about how ownership and control of production is organized. It's not whether or not you use money and prices in order to coordinate the distribution of consumer goods. That's a separate thing. In fact, we have this whole branch of socialism called market socialism that makes a very robust defense of the idea that, hey, it's a good idea to have money and prices in order to help coordinate the distribution of consumer goods and help to kind of coordinate the allocation of capital and production in general. But that's completely compatible with having firms being owned by workers or having firms being owned by the government or whatever, right? So mixing up two different things here, ownership versus how the consumer market is kind of organized, is a different thing.
Not surprisingly, they always get it wrong. Have you ever noticed that late-stage socialist failures always run out of essential items like toilet paper? Of course, this isn't a problem for those who have the right connections with the right
not
people.
Too long ago
those
here.
chosen few get whatever they want, but everyone else is out of luck. Venezuela, once the richest country in South America, is the most recent example of socialism driving a prosperous country into an economic ditch. Now, maybe you think it's an unfair example.
Yeah,
I'm not sure why,
I don't
but
really
okay.
want to get into that.
We'll ignore the fact that leftist activists
please
celebrated it
ignore
as
it.
a great
Move
socialist
on.
success right up until it wasn't. But what about Western European countries?
What about 'em?
Don't
Let's go
they have
for it.
socialist economies?
More socialist?
People seem pretty happy there.
They do?
Why can't we have what they have?
Great question.
Free health care,
Why
free
not? Yeah.
college,
Yeah.
stronger unions.
Yeah?
Good question. And the answer may surprise you. There are no socialist countries in Western Europe.
Is that the answer? So the question is, why can't we have what they have, which he defines as free healthcare, free college, and stronger unions? Okay. And he says it's because they're not socialist. Right? I mean, I understand this makes for a lovely presentation, but that's not an answer, because we're not socialists either by his account, right? So so if they can have it and they're not socialist, then why can't we have it? You see what I'm saying? These kind of gone off the rails here. I think maybe like whoever wrote the script kind of, maybe it was done by a team. They didn't really piece it together, but that doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. This cannot be the answer to the question, why can't we have free healthcare, free college, and stronger union? It can't be because they're not socialist when we are also not socialists. So, okay.
Most are just as capitalist as the United States. The only difference, and it's a big one, is that they offer more government benefits than the U.S. does.
That's the only difference. We just went in 2 slides ago, and you said they have stronger unions. So that's not the only difference. Internal to your own video. I don't even need to go outside of the video. I could just go back a little bit in the video, right? And we see here they have the stronger unions, right? Free healthcare,
free
that's a
college,
government, that's a government, but then stronger unions. That's not just, they just have more government
benefits. The only
benefits.
difference, and it's a big one, is that they offer more government benefits than the U.S. does. We can argue about the cost of these benefits and the point at which they reduce individual initiative, thus doing more harm than good.
Yeah.
Scandinavians have been debating those questions for years. But only a free market capitalist economy can produce the wealth necessary to sustain all of the supposedly free stuff Europeans enjoy. To get the free stuff, after all, you have to create enough wealth to...
Okay. So I want to pause here, right? Because he talks about the Scandinavians for a second, and I suppose we should just hone in on this, okay? So only a free market capitalist
can produce the
economy
wealth
can
necessary
produce the wealth
to sustain all of the supposedly free stuff Europeans enjoy.
Right. Okay. So this is a move that I would say this is the current move of the right when it comes to talking about social democratic or socialist societies, especially in Northern Europe. I would say 10, 15 years ago when I was just coming into the game, they would say, oh, these countries, yeah, they're more socialistic, but they suffer because of it. They're really nowhere, the standard of living is way below our standard of living. So, it's maybe good compared to certain third world nations, but their socialism has really doomed them, and it's nowhere, they're just not on our level of material well-being and whatever. I think maybe because of the internet or whatever, they just have kind of abandoned the idea of trying to say that it sucks to live in Sweden or it sucks to live in Norway or something. It's just really easy to tell this today that that's not true, right? You can get a lot of information from these countries. You can watch people on YouTube from these countries. You can, the availability of that information, it makes that a hard sell. So these days, instead of saying, they're more socialistic, but they are worse for it, they say, yeah, these are great countries, but they're not really socialist. It's really just a free market capitalist economy plus a welfare state. Now, I want to use a I want to talk about this claim in the context of Norway in particular, because Norway is the most socialist developed country in the world by conventional standards. And by that, I mean not that they have a big welfare state, though they do. I mean that they just have a tremendous amount of public ownership. It's not just free market capitalism plus Medicare for all, free healthcare, or free college. It's not. It's massive, massive, massive state ownership. So I wrote this piece back in 2018. The state owns 76% of Norway's non-home wealth. For this piece, I start with the state ownership statistics, which I got from the World Inequality Report, but the World Inequality Report is based on the Norwegian national accounts, which I was able then to double check and do some of my own calculations using the same accounts. But if you look just at the national accounts in Norway, what you'll find is the Norwegian state owns 58.6% of the country's wealth. So for that, you just get public wealth, and you divide it by public wealth plus private wealth, right? Because public wealth plus private wealth is all wealth. So you put public wealth, divide, right? 58.6%. That's the majority of it. And what I do in this piece is I just take that number and I take home ownership out of the equation. So I take home equity out of the denominator and just kind of remove it. So if we just take non-home assets out of the picture, what do we get? And the answer is that you get 76% of non-home wealth is owned by the Norwegian state. That's a tremendous amount. In Norway, almost everyone above the age of 25 owns their own home. It's 80% plus. So if you take home out of the equation, you just focus on sort of productive assets or financial assets, not just, where you happen to live or whatever. It's 3 out of 4 kroner of wealth is owned by the state. That's not just ordinary capitalism. It's nowhere close to that. I have this other piece written in 2019. Norway is far more socialist than Venezuela. Since he brought up Venezuela, I thought I would highlight this. I'll include this in the description box, but I just kind of go through some of the statistics on this. So I won't belabor the point here for that one. And Norway's public wealth, the biggest part of Norway's public wealth comes from its sovereign wealth fund. You see, when they hit oil in the 70s or whatever, offshore in Norway, the Norwegian state immediately, declared this is state property. All the oil under the continental shelf there belongs to the government, belongs to the people, will be managed collectively. It doesn't belong to any company. So they immediately sort of nationalized the oil deposits. And then they created a state-owned oil company called Statoil. And then there's actually 2 state-owned oil companies, one Hydro Norsk, but that one's sort of a more minor one. So they have 2 state-owned oil companies, and they have nationally owned oil deposits, and they use all that state ownership to just, every time all the profits that they got from the oil, they invested in this giant fund. And you can go to their website and see the fund's market value. They have a little widget here, which is fun to watch. This is 12 trillion kroner. 12 trillion kroner. So, and that probably means nothing to you, but down here we have it in dollars. So as of 2022, the last time they kind of populated this graph, the total market value is $1,180 billion, which is $1.18 trillion. That's the size of this fund, which is publicly owned by the state of Norway. Publicly owned by the state of Norway. You can see, look at it, grow, 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 grow. What a lovely graph that is. To put that in perspective, the population of Norway is 5.4 million people. So if we take the $1.18 trillion wealth fund and we divide it by the 5.4 million people, we get $218,195 per person. So the wealth fund, that wealth fund alone, represents roughly $220,000 per person. For a family of 4 like mine, that's $880,000 of wealth that is essentially being managed collectively in this fund for all the Norwegians. That would be just my family's share, if you will, in that fund. And what they do with the fund every year, they take, I think it's now down to 3%. They take 3% of the fund's value, which is basically their expectation of what its return will be, though its return has far exceeded that. But they take less than its annual return each year, and they bring that into the government budget. So it helps finance, whatever you want to think, hospitals, education, old age pensions, et cetera, right? So that's a massive, massive, massive publicly owned, collectively owned wealth pool that I think quite clearly distinguishes it from ordinary capitalism that's just like whatever you're used to with private capitalists and whatever. But here's the thing. It's not just this wealth fund. It's not just the oil fund, as they used to call it. They also own state-owned enterprises, right? I mean, and this is not hard to find out, right? I mean, you can very easily find this shit these days. So every year they put out a state ownership report. This is the last one. It was for year 2021, though they released it in September. And I love this report. I read it every year. It's a fun little report. And in this report, if you click through, you can get a nice little rundown of all the ownership here. They own 71 companies. Those companies employ 332,000 people. Now, remember, the population of Denmark is only 5.4 million people. Only about half of those people are in the workforce. The other half are going to be children, elderly, disabled people, students, whatever. Only about half are in the workforce. So we're talking about 2.7 million workers. And 300,000 of that 2.7 million is employed just in these 71 state-owned companies. And we got here in the state-owned companies, we got Equinor, that's their biggest oil company. We've got DNB Bank, that's their biggest consumer bank. So think Bank of America. For this one, think ExxonMobil. So they own their equivalent of ExxonMobil is state-owned. Their equivalent of the Bank of America is state-owned. Telenor is the telecom, so think AT&T. Their equivalent of AT&T or Verizon is state-owned. And, we can go on and on from there. Last year, these state-owned enterprises generated a 58.6 billion kroner dividend that was sent to the federal government as profit that now flows to everyone in the form of public services. And yeah, they had a pretty good year. The return on their listed companies, the companies that have that are listed on the stock exchange, was 53.6%. Quite a year and quite an improvement from the year prior, in which it was -4. And then for their non-listed companies, the one that did purely privately, not on any stock exchange, they still had a really nice return of 14.6%. So lovely, lovely situation here. And another great resource for talking about their state ownership that I've really enjoyed reading over the years is this book. This book is actually written by management professors, professors of business management in a Norwegian university, which is kind of funny because, obviously different kinds of people talk about things differently and use different kinds of words. So, they talk a lot about state ownership, but they also, they're kind of strange about state ownership. So we have here the capitalist state or the state as private owner. And, the upshot of this is they want to be like, yeah, Norway does own a lot of the wealth. The state does own a lot of the enterprises and the companies and the assets and all that shit. But in a way, it's kind of just like a capitalist own. Yeah, it's a state owner, but is it not also just kind of a capitalist owner? It's like, dude, whatever floats your boat. If that's what you need to feel good about this, then go for it. I don't really care what you call it. I just want to get there. So in the intro of this chapter, they say, a key characteristic of Norwegian businesses and society is the extensive state ownership, particularly in listed companies. The Norwegian state owns approximately 30% of the values in the Oslo Stock Exchange and controls companies that account for more than half of the market value. This is quite extensive, not least compared with other countries. So 30% of the market value on the Oslo Stock Exchange is owned by the government. And then over 50% of companies that account for more than 50% of the stock exchange market cap are controlled by the government. So either the government owns like shares, or they own so much of the company that they effectively control it, even if they don't own all the shares of the company, right? So there might be some minority holdings from private shareholders and whatever. So again, I would ask yourself, is that normal capitalism? Is that what we think of when we say that's just normal capitalism? That's normal capitalism. I don't think so. Only other thing I want to mention in this paper, which I think is interesting, is they talk about kind of the last big challenge to this model, because they've been state owning stuff for a long time. I guess you could say it started with, I wouldn't say started, but it became a somewhat big thing in World War II, because they nationalized anything that Germans owned in Norway. They brought it into state ownership, obviously, of course, with the World War II there. And then from there, they were really big about wanting to publicly own any kind of resource-based industry. So any kind of like hydro or oil, obviously, even fishing and the mining, all the kind of natural resource-based industries. They wanted to bring that into public ownership because they correctly surmise that it's not really fair to allow private owners to profit from natural resources, which they did not create. Anyways, in 2001, there was a thought that, oh shit, this thing is going to implode, because there was a conservative government that took over, and they put together a coalition so that they could run the government. That is a coalition between multiple parties, so it's not like in the U.S. they have multiple parties. So when you govern, you got to get a number of right-wing parties lined up so that you get a majority of the parliament, and then you kind of form a government that way. And one of the parties that the conservatives needed was the Progress Party. The Progress Party is like a xenophobic, like racist party. So it's not as business conservative. It's more just, anti-immigrant and that sort of thing. That put it in an interesting situation, because for a time it looked like they were going to join with the conservatives and they were going to reduce state ownership, right? That was the plan. But, when push came to shove, they took a different approach, and the Progress Party's leader said, look, the Conservative Party, who's trying to sell off all the state assets, they're stuck in the past. With a rich state and just a few private capitalists, we are choosing to take a new approach. It makes no sense for the state to sell out of strategically important Norwegian companies, putting profits of nearly 80 billion kroner in the petroleum fund, which will then buy minority interests in international companies. So the Progress Party basically says, no, we're not going to sell off all this state ownership. We're going to hold on to it. And one part of it that's very interesting, which is obvious as soon as you think about it, but I think is a little bit not obvious if you haven't heard the point before, is that one of the reasons why Norway can't just like sell off all of its assets, and strip the state of state ownership, is that Norway lacks private ownerships. Norway lacks private owners who could take over the state shares. This is an expression of the fact that Norway is a country of modest differences. A good picture of this was provided in the book, The State as Capitalist. In 2014, the market value of the state shares in listed companies was 650 billion kroner. At the same time, if one were to add up the fortunes of the 100 first entries on the list of wealthiest Norwegians, it only amounted to 580 billion kroner. So the combined wealth of the 100 wealthiest Norwegians was less than the holdings of the government just in the stock market. That's not even including the wealth fund. That's just their ownership in the stock market, and that's not even including their unlisted wealth, right? Because the Norwegian company also owns stock in unlisted companies that are not on the stock exchange. But just if you compare stock exchange to stock exchange, just that little bit of slice, The Norwegian state owns more of the stock market than the wealthiest 100 Norwegians combined. As he says, in other words, a massive transfer of wealth would have to take place if Norwegian capitalists were to take over parts of the state shares. And I mean, another way to put it is, if we go back to here, if you own 76% of the non-home wealth, how do you privatize it? Who do you sell it to? The Norwegians don't have enough private wealth to buy the shares from the government. You can't even sell it to them because you own more wealth than they own. And of course, if you were to sell it to them, what would that amount to? They would give you assets just like you would get just as many assets from them as you gave to them. Your wealth position wouldn't be changed, right? So the only way to do this is to kind of spend it down over time by like cutting taxes and running a deficit and whatever. Or the other thing you can do is sell this wealth internationally. And that's where I think the Progress Party comes in. They're so xenophobic. They would rather, even though they're conservative, they would rather have the government own the wealth than to sell it off to international capital and have essentially rich Europeans and rich Americans own the country. And then they're just kind of like a vassal state of international capital flows. They don't want that. So instead they have massive, massive state ownership. The last thing I want to say on that here is it's not just the wealth fund, the oil fund, is not just the state ownership of these companies. They also have massive public employment in what's called general government. General government is stuff like teachers in this country, doctors and nurses and stuff, because those are public, unlike here. Daycare workers, whatever, right? People you think of as like government workers here, they have that as well. 30.7% of Norway's workforce is employed in general government. And so, we can see in this graph here where that stacks up. Norway is number one at 31%. Then we got Sweden at number 2. Then we got Denmark, we got Israel, and then we got Finland. So the four Nordics are at the top of the four Nordics are at the top of employment in the public sector. And that doesn't even include the people who are employed in the state-owned enterprises, which, remember, the state-owned enterprises, they have another 332,000 people. It doesn't include the wealth fund. I don't want to belabor the point here, but the idea that, it's just normal capitalism over there, just normal-ass capitalism, and then they have a welfare state, that's so clearly not true. So clearly not true. You can spend a second Googling it and you can find all these resources and clearly see that that's not true. They have massive, massive, massive public ownership. Anyways, let's finish the video.
To get the free stuff, after all, you have to create enough wealth to generate enough tax revenue to pay for everything the government gives away.
Right. And so here's the question, right? So if the government needs to generate tax revenue, wouldn't a good way to do that be to simply own the assets of the economy? Because if the government owns those assets, then instead of profits flowing to private owners, the profits just flow up to the state. And then they can just use the profits to pay for the free stuff. You don't need the taxes if you just own the wealth and therefore receive the benefit from the wealth. That is exactly what is happening in Norway. They take their massive state ownership and the return on that state ownership goes into general government, and then they can use that return to pay for the free stuff. Public ownership facilitates the welfare state. It's not like he's saying, what you have to do is you have to have private ownership because only the private owners can produce things and then you can... No. The public ownership is a much more direct way to get the revenue in to the government in order to fund the welfare programs. Much more direct. And publicly owned entities can also be massively productive. They can also be massively productive, right?
Without capitalism, you're Venezuela. In a 2015 speech at Harvard, Denmark's prime minister took great pains to make this point. I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with socialism.
This is a right-winger in
Therefore,
Denmark.
I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy.
again, we go back to planning versus socialism, right? Denmark is not a socialist planned economy. None of them are planned economies in the sense that most of the production is done through like production quotas issued down by the state. But the substance of socialism is not whether you use planning or dollars and prices to help facilitate, decisions about what consumer goods to produce and how to distribute them and whatever. It's not whether you use money or planning. It's who owns the enterprises, who receives the profits from the enterprises, who controls and owns the enterprises. In these countries, especially Norway and especially Finland, there's way more public ownership than there is here, massively more public ownership. Now, I will say Denmark is lesser than Norway and Finland, but still miles ahead of where we are when it comes to public ownership.
So when you point to Denmark as a paragon of socialism, you're really singing the praises of capitalism. The more capitalism, the less socialism you need. Look at America since 2017. A policy of lower taxes and less government regulation.
What is this? What is the what is this? What's the unit here? Can you bar grab? I mean, whatever.
That's more capitalism. Has led to a robust economic expansion, something thought impossible just a few years earlier. Unemployment, notably among minority groups typically most at risk for poverty, is at a generational low. Economic expansion gets people off welfare and into work. That's less socialism.
I'll get in here, even though it's not really relevant to socialism, but the idea that like you basically have people, when employment goes up, you get some people off of like unemployment benefits, though we really don't have unemployment benefits in the U.S., not meaningfully. And so there's like a little bit of truth to that, but by and large, the vast majority of welfare spending is just unaffected by whether the labor market, whether we have high, whether the labor market is going, whether unemployment is low or high. Because the vast majority of people who aren't working are people who are just not in the labor market at all, right? They're people who are retired, they're people who are disabled, they're people who are too young to work. And so like the labor market conditions just don't really matter. So I mean, like you move the needle a little bit when the labor market is hot because you can pull some people off of the unemployment rolls, but it's tiny. It's really tiny. Like most of the people who aren't working aren't going to work regardless. And that's what most of the welfare spending goes to. It goes to Social Security or benefits for disabled people. And, it's not mostly unemployed people. That's like the tiniest sliver of the welfare state. But people seem to think that's the whole thing. It's all just people who are out of work at the moment but looking to get back in. That's not really how the welfare state works at all.
None of this requires a degree in economics. Common sense is all you need. That's why it's so frustrating to see young people praising socialism and criticizing capitalism. It's bad enough that they're working against their own interests, better job prospects, better wages, personal freedom. But they're also working against the interest of the less fortunate. Capitalism leads to economic democracy. Socialism leads to the economic dictatorship of the elite.
No.
Always and everywhere.
No. No, what are you talking about? A capitalist firm is a dictatorship, right? The shareholders devolving power to the board, which devolves power to the CEO. Through that process at the top, I mean, I guess there's some deliberation among that small group of people, right? Very, very wealthy people. They just dictate what happens in the firm. Right? The workers don't get to decide what happens in the firm. They don't have a vote. They don't get to say, I don't really want to do that. Or actually, I think the pay should be this. Or actually, I think our work day should be this. Or actually, I think we should go after this market or we should pivot. They don't get to decide any of that. There's no democratic aspect of it. It is an authoritarian structure. Now, maybe you say, hey, not everything in our life needs to be democratic, right? That could be a position you take. But you can't say it is democratic. It's not. It's not. It's the opposite. A socialist society, at least one, if you think again about Norway, where the public collectively owns all this wealth, if you have a government that is democratic, right? Genuinely democratic, meaning you get to vote in elections and it really tries to reflect the will of the people and whatever. That's a much more democratic structure because the wealth is owned and managed by a government that everyone has a vote in, right? I don't have a vote in what any of the private companies do, even if I work there, let alone if I'm just some random person. I don't have a vote in it. So it's less democracy.
So beware what you ask for. You just might get it. I'm Andy Puzder, the author of The Capitalist Comeback for Prager University.